Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Friday, August the 16th, 2024. So, I formally immigrated to the US in 2011. So, when I immigrated, I sort of flew from Europe to SeaTac Airport, that's sort of Seattle, Tacoma, and I had this big brown envelope, this sealed brown envelope with all these immigration documents. And so when I went through immigration, I had to hand this document, this envelope over, and they would look at it. And so I was taken aside, had to spend some time in a windowless room waiting to be processed. And so in the end, the immigration officer said everything was okay, and I talked to him a bit, and he gave me this one final, I won't say piece of advice, it was actually a sort of a command. He said to me, whatever you do in America, there's one thing you absolutely must not do in America. That is vote. You cannot vote. He could have told me to do lots of other things, but he said, do not vote. And of course, I don't vote. I'm still not an American citizen. I don't think I ever will be an American citizen. I've got Taurus rising. I've got Mars in Taurus. I'm very much into taking things seriously in some ways. If I say something, if I make a pledge, if I make a promise, I don't do it unless I mean it. And so, in order to be an American citizen, that would mean I'd have to say a pledge of allegiance, and I'm certainly not ready to say a pledge of allegiance to the United States. So yeah, I'm a green card holder, but I am not an American citizen. Of course, there are other problems. The process of naturalization, you've got forms, you've got to pay fees. I don't know, you might have to hire lawyers. I don't know, I don't want to go down that road. So, in terms of the election, I'm obviously not going to be voting for anyone because I can't vote. But I did notice, looking at the comments section, that I did attract some negative comments yesterday. I had a video where I talked about Trump, and I talked about some of the things that might be going wrong for him right now. And I had to be negative. I had to look at some of the negative things going on, some of his progressions, his solar return. Now, I think I got into big trouble because I said as a matter of fact that he had supposedly slurred his speech when he was talking to Elon Musk. I don't know whether he was slurring his speech or not. I perhaps stated it wrongly. I should have said some people had claimed he'd slurred his speech. Some progressives had claimed he'd slurred his speech. Again, I don't know whether he slurred his speech, but there was a perception in some quarters that he'd slurred his speech. And I think there's little doubt that his campaign has had a bit of a hiccup over the last few days, maybe the last couple of weeks. He's been focusing perhaps on the wrong things, perhaps on whether Kamala Harris is Asian or black or whatever. Perhaps that was the wrong focus. He should have perhaps been focusing on, policies. So there was a bit of aggravation on the comments board, but I am not biased here. I'm just pointing out that astrologically there are a few things going wrong. That doesn't mean to say I believe he is going to lose the election. If you have looked at my previous videos, generally speaking, I am more critical of Democrats than Republicans. I think someone even suggested, I shouldn't pay any attention, but I shouldn't be involving myself in American politics because it's none of my business. Well, I do live in the country, so I think I can say something about it. I mean, people said similar things actually when I was critical about Kamala Harris. So when I'm critical about Kamala Harris, they sort of say, stop interfering in American politics. You know nothing about American politics and so forth. But as I said, I do live in the country, in the US. I am an American taxpayer, so I don't have I don't have a vote. So in a way, I shouldn't have to pay tax. Don't they say no tax without representation? Or I can't vote, so why the hell should I pay tax? But anyway, I am a taxpayer, but I am not a voter. How would I vote if I did have a vote? I don't know. I really don't know. I think if you're interested in, as I always say, if you're interested in world peace, then you should probably vote for Donald Trump. If you're interested in, I don't know, if you're interested in the environment, then you should probably vote for the Democrats. I don't think the Democrats are much better in terms of the Republicans, in terms of the environment. Certainly, looking at local politics here in Washington State, the Democrats are just as bad as the Republicans. Perhaps worse because they're hypocritical about it. They go on and on about climate change. In fact, both of them go on about climate change, but they still tear the environment apart. So I do closely watch local politics. And so, yeah, again, I think I have a right to say something about American politics. Now, as far as today is concerned, I want to talk about a square between Mars and Saturn. That is the big aspect today. And of course, I will be talking about the astrology and the I Ching of the day, but I do want to talk about that square between Mars and Saturn. And I think it's a major event, not least because it's tied with a wider square between Jupiter and Saturn, which is exact on Monday. And so in terms of this square between Mars and Saturn, I want to look at a few famous people, and I also want to look at some events, and I want to sort of consider some basic themes of Mars-Saturn. So if you look at the thumbnail that I've got, you have got bottom right, that's an electric chair, and there is a relevance to the electric chair and Mars-Saturn. Top right, also man with a cigar, that is Albert Pierpoint, who had a Mars-Saturn square, and he was a celebrated British executioner. And you got Boris Johnson, and you got the Emperor Nero, who had a square between Mars and Saturn. I will be talking about one person who is not famous, who has a square between Mars and Saturn. That's my grandfather. I briefly want to talk about my grandfather. I've been thinking about my grandfather, and I think I kind of get an idea about how his Mars-Saturn square actually works. So perhaps you'll indulge me on that. I know I shouldn't be talking about my family here. It's of no interest to you, but he was a Leo. It was his birthday quite recently, so why not? I can talk about him, can't I? Just a bit. Okay, so it's now time to talk about the astrology and the I Ching for today. Now, before I do that, I just want to remind you that if you happen to like this video, I would be very grateful if you were to indicate that you liked it. And if you're not subscribed and you like the video, I would be super happy if you were to subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, but it does make a big difference to the channel. Okay, so let's look at what's happening today. So here is the chart for noon today, Friday, August the 16th. And you can see that we've got the moon in Capricorn. Moon right in the middle of Capricorn. So it doesn't matter what your time zone is, that's where the moon is. And so with moon in Capricorn, there is always going to be a certain amount of self-interest here with the moon in this position. We do have to look after our own interests. In fact, I think we should be looking after our own interests because perhaps no one else is. And so there could be a certain amount of selfish materialism today, and I don't think that should be ashamed. We should be ashamed of that. And I think we might say that charity begins at home. There might be a lot of people in a bad situation, but perhaps our first priority is to look after our loved ones and, of course, to look after ourselves. And that moon in Capricorn is making a trine to Venus. And moon trine Venus is it's a nice aspect, but it is a somewhat materialistic aspect because Venus is in Virgo, in the sign of its fall. It's fallen in Virgo, so we've got moon in its detriment in Capricorn, trine Venus, fallen in Virgo. I mean, I think it allows us to be quite sociable, to get on with people, but perhaps all the while we are perhaps thinking about our own interests. You know, there's no such thing as a free lunch. If we're going to be nice to someone, perhaps we want something in return. We may just feel it's in our interests to be pleasant. And that's perhaps something we can focus on today. But again, I must emphasize, there's nothing wrong with putting one's own interests first. In fact, you could say everything is about self-interest, isn't it? And, you know, we need to get on with other people. It helps us. It helps us get on. It helps us profit. It perhaps is a good investment for the future. But the main aspect today is, of course, Mars square Saturn. And this Mars square Saturn, it's exact, and it is a difficult aspect. Mars in Gemini is running up against that square to Saturn. That means that it may be difficult to get things done, and there may be a great sense of frustration, and there may be a certain amount of tension. And I think it's just made so much more intense by the fact that it's linked up with Jupiter. So we've had Jupiter square, Jupiter conjunct Mars. Yesterday we had Mars on the Jupiter-Saturn midpoint, and today we have got the Mars-Saturn square. And so there's so much we want to do, but at the same time there's so much we can't do. And so the question is, how do we deal with this situation where we have a lot of energy, for many of us have a lot of energy, but we can't apply it in quite the way we would like. And, you know, even if we're only wanting to exert this energy verbally, like Mars in Gemini, there's so much Mars in Gemini wants to talk about, wants to express, but Saturn is saying, no, you can't do that. And we may just feel that we can't express ourselves, and that might in turn lead to anger. And of course, Mars-Saturn as an aspect is traditionally connected with bad things. I mean, Mars is the lesser malefic, Saturn is the greater malefic. As a pair, Mars and Saturn are connected with death, or a concern about death. And I suppose I'm part of that, aren't I? I'm doing this video about Mars-Saturn. I'm really into Mars-Saturn. I think Mars-Saturn as a pair is really interesting. So it is something I want to do, talk about it, but it does also show my concern about death. You've got a thumbnail there with an electric chair. Of course, I had to do that, didn't I? And an executioner, Albert Pierpoint. It is all about death. It doesn't mean to say it's going to be a deadly day. I think for ordinary people, it's not really about death. It's more about frustration. But death might be something that a lot of us are thinking about. Now, I'm just going to say one thing about Kamala Harris, simply from a perspective of balance. I mean, I said it last week, I think, but just from a perspective of balance, you know, I was being sort of accused of being maybe too critical of Donald Trump in yesterday's video. So just a reminder, I mean, I've already talked about this, but just a reminder about Kamala Harris's chart and what's happening to Kamala Harris's chart. There is Kamala Harris's chart, and you will notice that Kamala Harris has her Venus at 1754 Virgo. So 1754 Virgo. So in other words, this Mars-Saturn square really hits Kamala Harris. Hits it hard. And I don't know what's going on in Kamala Harris's life. The mainstream media is telling us how the Democrats are ahead in the polls. Of course, it's still a toss-up. If you take a statistical percentage chance, it's about 50-50 who's going to win in November. But I think it could be a bad day for Kamala Harris, a particularly bad day. She's got, after all, Mars square her Venus. She's got Saturn square her Venus. And I think that it's been said about Kamala Harris, hasn't it, that she has a high staff turnover. People just find it difficult to get on with her when they're working for her. And so maybe that's what's going to happen. Maybe she'll have difficult relations with the people working under her. But maybe we'll never find out about it. Perhaps even if something bad does happen, the mainstream media might cover it all up. At least that's what some people think, that the mainstream media are distorting things, and they're saying that Trump is slurring his words when actually he's not. Okay, so that's Kamala Harris. Sorry about that diversion. So I've looked at the geocentric picture today, which is Friday, August the 16th. We have Mars square Saturn, we have Moon trine Venus, but actually there's not much else going on. Those are the two main aspects today. Now, looking at the heliocentric picture, looking at things from a perspective of the sun, you make the sun the center of the solar system, and where of course it should be, but we sort of sometimes forget that. And I don't think that there is actually a great deal happening heliocentrically, except for the fact that the Earth is square Uranus. Now today the Earth is exactly square Uranus, and we've been tracking this square between the Earth and Uranus towards exactitude. Now, it happens pretty close to the Sun being square Uranus, because we've got the Sun in late Leo making a square to Uranus in late Taurus. But the geocentric square between the Sun and Uranus happens sort of early next week. But today, Friday, we've got the Earth square Uranus. And of course, it's happening on the same day as Mars square Saturn. And so this perhaps adds fuel to the fire and may indicate that today there may be happenings. I wouldn't have thought that the happenings today would be particularly fortunate. So we need to watch events today with Mars square Saturn. And it's not just any Mars square Saturn. Remember, it's tied up with Jupiter, because Mars is still pretty much conjunct Jupiter. It's square Saturn, plus we now throw in Earth square Uranus. And I think right now just things are not particularly stable, even though geocentrically we only really have two main aspects at Mars square Saturn and the Moon trine Venus. And I'm hoping the fact that we have got not so many aspects today means that my forecast for the 12 signs are going to perhaps be briefer than usual, I hope. Okay, so let me now do my forecast for the 12 signs for today, which is Friday, August 16th, 2024. Let's just change the coordinate system back to the geocentric coordinates. Okay, so these are my forecasts for Friday for the 12 signs. Aries. Perhaps Aries are being a little more focused and responsible than you were yesterday. You are starting to become aware that there are things that you do have to do, and you can't shirk your responsibilities, and there's no actual need to shirk your responsibilities, because I think that you're going to get all the help you need, and you can, if you're clever and disciplined, you can sort of channel your energy into, the achievement of, your short-term goals. And these goals could be, as I said, of a very materialistic nature. Just things that you have to do, that you were supposed to do. And that means if you're engaged in anything material, whether it's money or work or organization, I actually think that you can do a really good job. And you might actually surprise yourself about how much you're able to accomplish. And also, I think that in most cases, your people skills are going to be pretty good. And it'll be because really you know how to behave. I know that Aries can be too assertive, can be too impulsive, but I think that today you're going to be able to control yourself and pay some attention to other people's sensibilities. So that is certainly good. It may not be particularly exciting, yet we can't avoid the fact, Aries, that Mars is making a square aspect to Saturn. And, Mars is your ruler. And if it's square Saturn, there may be times when you feel really quite frustrated. And you have to remember that Mars is not just square Saturn, it is conjunct Jupiter. So many things you'd like to do, you'd like to have fun, but there are just obligations and very real things that could be holding you back. And it's just going to be important that you don't overreact. Now, I've said that overall I think that you are actually quite responsible today, and you understand the limitations that are being placed upon you. But it doesn't mean to say that you feel privately that everything is great. I don't think that's the case. I think that you're going to be annoyed in certain situations. And of course, if you get annoyed and you're not able to express your annoyance, it may get transferred into something else, and you might at some unconscious level create a situation. And so that's perhaps a rider on responsibility. Yes, I think you are responsible. I think your conscious mind is trying to be responsible and it's trying to do the right thing. But your unconscious mind may be working in a different way. It may feel a certain need to create disruption. So perhaps with the Mars-Saturn square, you may just reach the point where just something happens. It seems to be an accident. It seems to be a mistake, but there might be some level of psychological determinism here, that your mind your unconscious mind has just created a situation. And, it goes without saying, Aries, that you have to be careful if you're doing anything that is dangerous. You just don't do it. And if you're driving, be careful. And if you're working with machinery or you're doing something difficult, just be very careful, because Mars square Saturn can be about accidents. It can be about things happening that are very frustrating, and it just seems that unconsciously something is trying to destroy the peace, and you really do have to watch that. But I suppose the way to go through today is, sure, live up to your responsibilities, but also to accept your sense of frustration. Make it a part of who you are. Don't deny it. And perhaps in certain cases, it might be a good idea to find ways of working it off, if appropriate. If you, for example, through exercise, if that's medically appropriate. I mean, don't overdo it. Obviously, strenuous exercise needs medical advice if you're going to do that kind of thing, but that's certainly something to consider. So, Aries, we can't underestimate the fact that the Mars-Saturn square is problematic. But that doesn't mean to say it's going to be a bad day. In fact, I think today could be very constructive. And regardless of everything going on, I think that you are going to be able to live up to your responsibilities. Taurus. Yes, there is a square between Mars and Saturn, but I don't think that square between Mars and Saturn needs spoil your day. I don't think it will spoil your day. I mean, I suppose the important point with that Mars-Saturn square is possibly to watch other people and see what they're up to, see what they're feeling, because today you may find that some of the people around you are quite frustrated and are annoyed, and they're even angry about certain things, and they might attempt to throw that anger onto you. Even people who under normal circumstances are perfectly pleasant, people you know very well, who've got a good track record of good behaviour, but just today they are under pressure and they might snap. Or it's possible with Mars square Saturn that some people are just feeling frustrated and angry and they don't know what to do, and maybe there's something you can do to reassure them that things are going to be okay. It is connected with this Mars-Saturn square, but this Mars-Saturn square does not last forever. It will eventually break up. Over the next couple of days, we'll be moving on to something else. So don't take it to heart if you find that other people seem to be very frustrated and they might be taking out their frustrations on you. That is certainly possible. And by the same token, it's important not to be impatient with people. If people are taking longer than usual to get things done, or if there are hold-ups, don't be surprised and don't get annoyed about it. But arguably, the main aspect taking place today for you, Taurus, is not the Mars-Saturn square. It's a trine between the Moon and Venus. So the Moon is in Capricorn, Venus is in Virgo. And of course, it's happening in Earth signs. And of course, Taurus is an Earth sign. So there is an easy relationship between that Moon trine Venus and your sign. And it means that things can actually start to move in a way that you feel comfortable with. So do consider your interactions with other people. I mean, these interactions with other people can, I think, be fairly fortunate, but there will tend to be a purpose behind them. I don't think it's a day for just meeting people for the sake of it, talking to people just for the sake of it with no agenda. I think there is going to be an agenda. And I think that from your perspective, you're going to be saying, how can you benefit? How can this interaction of this person help you in the future? In the future could be in 5 minutes' time, could be in 5 years' time, but there will be an awareness that things do have their consequences, and that people just don't just do things for free. That both parties benefit, and I think ideally, in social interaction, when you're interacting with people socially, you should just ask yourself, who benefits? How do you benefit? How does the other person benefit? And if you can identify where the benefit is, I think it's going to just make things a lot easier. When people are playing games, when they're pretending that there's no benefit, they're pretending that they're completely selfless, then there's a problem. But honesty, I think, is going to be really very important. Now, that might sound a little bit too transactional. What about the spiritual side of things? What about the inspirational side? Well, it can be there. I think that this moon trine Venus does suggest that you can benefit from social interaction, not just on a material level. I think you can actually benefit on an inspirational level as well. Perhaps you're going to have a chance to see things from a different view, and that's always important with Taurians, because Taurians can actually be very stubborn. They can, decide that they've got it all sorted out. They can decide that they've understood the world and that's it, and there's nothing more to be discussed. But today, things might happen. People might say things which could give you pause for thought. You may be thinking, hold on, have you really got all the answers? Maybe there's something out there that actually needs to be given greater consideration. And so that's something to bear in mind. You shouldn't be of the opinion that what's in front of you is all there is. There is far more there, and perhaps the right relationship can help you to explore the world around you. And finally, Taurus, if you've got something to say, then probably you should say it. It is actually a great day for Taurians to be saying things that are on your mind. Now, you might think, oh, well, that's going to be difficult because you've got Mars square Saturn. Yeah, Mars square Saturn can make self-expression difficult for some people, but I don't think it's going to be a problem for you. So if you want to say something, even if you're concerned that it might get a negative response, I suspect you should just go ahead and say it and just then see what happens. Okay, not in all cases. You've got to evaluate the situation, but probably it's better to be open and honest rather than keep things to yourself. Gemini. The big aspect today is Mars square Saturn. And I think that this Mars square Saturn really could have quite a big impact on Geminis. But not necessarily a bad impact. I think that this Mars square Saturn could actually be quite useful. So, you've got Mars in Gemini. Mars is in your sign. It's a very energetic placement. There's a lot you want to do. There's a lot you've got to say, and you probably don't want to stay still for too long. Then Mars squares Saturn. So you might think that Mars square Saturn is about frustration. You can't do what you want. All of that energy, Mars in Gemini, just hits a brick wall. Okay, that might be the case if you have recently been scattering your energy has been going all over the place, you haven't got a focus, then yeah, it could be quite a frustrating day. On the other hand, if you're able to be focused, decide what you want, decide what you don't want, then I think that the Mars-Saturn square could actually be very useful. It could help you to create structure, and you can really focus your power on specific goals. And I think in this way, Saturn is going to be extremely useful. Now, you might not have much fun doing all of this. I mean, having to be very focused, if you're a Gemini, can be hard work. At least, me speaking as someone with Sun in Gemini, focus is difficult. I always wonder whether I do actually have attention deficit disorder. I know it's very popular, but when I look back at my behaviour at school, I think I probably did have attention deficit disorder, and I still do have it. And so for Gemini, I think, I know but again, it is a very popular condition to have. But today, I think you can focus. on the important things. Indeed, you should focus. And I think you can actually be very impressive, because you can take your mental power, all the stuff you know, all the stuff you regard as being important, all of your interests can be all put into one thing, and through, I don't know, maybe a couple of hours of really hard work, hard concentration, you can perhaps accomplish in that short period of time what it's perhaps taken you a month or two to get together, or you perhaps what you failed to do in a couple of months, you can do today in a couple of hours, provided you give yourself the space and you give yourself the time, and you don't get distracted. That's always a problem for Geminis. Don't get distracted. And I think it's going to be a day when I think you won't get distracted, if any day like that actually exists, because it's not just that you've got Mars square Saturn. The moon is in Capricorn. I mean, I know it doesn't feel great if you're a Gemini having a moon in Capricorn, because Gemini and Capricorn are two signs that have basically nothing to do with each other. But still, with moon in Capricorn, that's really going to help you focus on the things that matter. And also, Gemini, I think that you'll have an honesty to you, just an honesty about who you are and what your weaknesses are, and also an honesty about your emotions. Geminis do have emotions, of course. One can sometimes forget that. I mean, Gemini has this reputation for being perhaps somewhat unemotional, but of course everyone has emotions regardless of their sign. But you are able to sort of think about your emotions, look at how your emotions have been working in the past, and perhaps at some level being able to control your emotions. And the moon in the moon in Capricorn does make a trine to Venus, and I think that moon trine Venus perhaps allows you to have reasonably good connections with other people, but always on your own terms. This is not a day for Geminis to be wildly socializing. Just stick to people and places that you know and trust. And if you can do that, then I think that your social skills will be pretty good, and I don't think you're going to rock the boat. And I think on balance, people are going to like you and also trust you. Cancer, you needn't worry too much about the Mars-Saturn square today. I mean, I know I've been talking about it a lot, but I'm not convinced that it need have a direct impact on you. And that is especially the case if you are on your own, or if you're not reliant on other people. Even if you are in a relationship, you don't have to focus on that relationship today if you don't want to. I think the problems of the Mars-Saturn square for a Cancerian would only become apparent if you were to spend a lot of time with one person. I mean, I think if you were to spend a lot of time with one person, then sure, things might become difficult. There might be a sense of frustration, not your frustration, just another person's frustrations. You'll be picking up on someone else's frustrations. You might find that people are projecting things on you, even accusing you of things, perhaps accusing you of cramping their style or getting in their way. But this is all just so unnecessary, I think. If you have a day in which you are making your own decisions, where you're not reliant on another person, in that case, things should be great. Now, when I say not reliant on another person, I'm not saying that you have to completely exclude other people. Other people always matter to some extent, but you don't want to be trapped by any one person or any group of people. You want to be able to keep your freedom, keep your room for maneuver. That really does matter. And I think you'll be helped by the fact that you actually have a good understanding of other people from a distance. You don't have to be in the same room as someone to understand someone. You can understand them, from miles away, perhaps even thousands of miles away. So you don't have to take the risk of social engagement to really understand someone. And if you are making your own decisions, and ideally, I think today you'll probably have a fairly rapid turnover of experiences, events, and interactions. So it's probably better from a social perspective if you meet lots of different people, perhaps for a short period of time, and you just don't allow things to intensify. And so as soon as you even think that something is intensifying, as soon as you feel that someone is starting to make demands upon you, then you can just move. And I know that's not typically Cancerian behavior. You might associate that kind of constant movement more with Gemini, but I think that today a certain amount of movement is going to be important, and I think you should ideally avoid things that are complicated. And that is especially going to be the case in terms of conversation. People have conversation. I think you'll actually today, Cancer, be a pretty good conversationalist, but do monitor the subject of your conversation. Conversations should ideally be about things that are fairly light-hearted, not about intense, serious subjects, certainly not about controversial subjects. And also, conversations should have a time limit. You don't have to talk to people for hours on end. Just have a light conversation. Use your social skills in one situation, and then just move on to something else and move on to someone else. And I think that is the best way of handling the day's energies. Leo, you continue to be, I think, well placed in terms of making things happen. I think that people will take you seriously, and you're not really someone to forget. That you just have this sort of basic intensity which is really difficult to ignore. And when you're in a position when you're telling people what's on your mind, when you're communicating, I think that people will listen to you. And if you want to sort of draw people in for whatever reason, if you feel that there's someone you would like to influence, then I think that you can actually do a pretty good job, because the things you say will be very convincing. And I don't think that people in most cases are going to contradict you. If you say something is true, then I think, people are going to take your word for it. And I think you'll be helped, Leo, by the fact that you'll just come over as being someone who is fairly sensible and mature and grounded, and you'll give the impression of understanding the facts and being level-headed and responsible. Now, that might sound a little boring, but to be honest, Leo, I think you should be happy if today's boring. I mean, just because today's boring doesn't mean that it's not productive. It can be extremely productive, especially in a material sense. If you're thinking about issues about organization, money, management, these kind of things can actually work out very well for you. And they will also help get people's trust, because you will seem, as I said, you will seem trustworthy, and you will seem materially trustworthy. Perhaps a kind of person that can be trusted with important jobs, can be trusted to look after money, can be trusted to look after the important details. Okay, there might be actually some danger that you have to do too much work. You might feel that someone else could be doing what you're doing, and there might be a little bit of resentment there, but I don't think you should worry about it. I don't think resentment would be appropriate. The key thing is, you do something useful, and if it's a little bit boring, then maybe that's best. I mean, that's sort of how it works, isn't it? If you have a panic attack, you perhaps, maybe that's just me, you just stay in one place, and it's okay. You're getting better when you're starting to be bored. And so boredom can be a sign of mental health, believe it or not. I mean, in my opinion, maybe I'm just talking about my own experiences. Now, as far as relationships are concerned, it may be actually a similar picture. When I was talking to Cancer, I was suggesting to Cancer that relationships should perhaps be avoided, that there's a certain advantage in being able to sort of make your own decisions and being able to be free. And I'd possibly say the same thing to you, that if there's a problem today, if there's a frustration today, it's probably going to be because of someone else's behavior. And it may not even be your frustration. It may be someone else's frustration, and someone else's frustration may be dumped on you. And so I would suggest that in terms of your social activities, I would just be very cautious. Don't meet people for the sake of it. If someone has let you down in the past, they're probably going to let you down again. If someone has frustrated you in the past, they're probably going to frustrate you again. And if you can do things on your own, in your own way, I think that would be better. Of course, sometimes things can't be avoided. I mean, I suppose if you're in a long-term relationship, you're with someone who you see all day long, and that can't be helped, then maybe you'll start to become aware that this person is, perhaps whether it's a partner or a spouse or whatever, could be annoyed about something, and something's really getting them down. And that's because of this Mars square Saturn. In that case, perhaps you can try to work out what it is. Maybe you should just talk to them, find out what's bothering them. It's probably something simple and something short term, but it's just that with Mars square Saturn, I think that small issues, small frustrations could be exaggerated, and they could be turned into huge concrete roadblocks. And that's not something you want to engage with, but if you have to engage with it, perhaps you can reassure someone that things aren't as bad as they seem on the surface. Virgo, you can't really avoid the Mars-Saturn square. Some people can, some people can't. I think that for Virgos, this Mars-Saturn square could be something of an issue. But perhaps you need to ask yourself how this Mars-Saturn square might be manifesting. I think at the moment, Virgo, you are, in your own way, fairly ambitious. You want to cover a lot of ground, I think. There are a lot of things that you want to achieve. And in some respects, it's a time when you can make very good progress. You've just had Mars conjunct Jupiter. It's moving fast. And now's a time when, if all of that energy that you've perhaps been storing up, you want to put it into the achievement of your ambitions. But Mars square Saturn there's something that you've perhaps not been considering that is getting in your way. Perhaps it's something you haven't wanted to consider because it's just too complicated, and you just didn't feel that complications was something you needed, that you could somehow make things simple and just ignore what was happening in some other part of the world, and in terms of maybe the next room. Maybe you take the view you're in this room, and what happens in the next room doesn't matter. But now the complications are there, and there is something holding you back. And I think it's really about a reality that you've always known existed. You've certainly known that this reality existed since certainly the beginning of 2023. You knew it was a problem, but you kind of swept it under the carpet. But now you've got to face it, and it could take the form of another person that just is difficult. They may be a bit cranky. They may take themselves too seriously. They may demand too much attention. But this person could be an annoyance, and you have to work out how to deal with them. They're not someone you can just tell them to go away, because I think they're important. Okay, it might not be another person. I suppose it could be just a situation that has been going on for a long time that you thought was unimportant, that you thought it would go away, but it's now becoming clear that it's not going away. Though it's just really important that you don't panic. It is something you can deal with, and probably the best way of dealing with it is, especially if it's to do with other people, is to firstly ask yourself, what is this person concerned about? What are they worried about? What are they complaining about? And then to just address these complaints head on. I think that this is something you actually can do, and you can do it actually with a certain amount of charm. If you want, you can be charming. I think your people skills today are actually very good because, Venus is moving through your sign. Venus is in Virgo. The moon is trine Venus. That's a very nice aspect. It's a very sympathetic aspect. And so with this sympathetic approach, you can deal with intractable people who, on the surface, they're just a problem and they're just going to make things bad for you, whatever happens. But no, you can deal with them, you can interact with them, you can get them to listen to you, and at the same time you can start to understand their point of view. And so perhaps that's what it's all about today. If you can understand something through dialogue, then this thing transforms itself into something that is harmless. It may actually even be useful. Because sometimes when you hit a block, whether that block is a person or a situation, that block actually exists for a purpose. In fact, you could say it always exists for a purpose. Nothing happens randomly. Nothing happens by chance. And so this is perhaps a moment where you can actually learn something about yourself and perhaps what you've been getting wrong in the past, what you perhaps have been underestimating an issue, but now it's becoming clear, it's right in front of you. And that's perhaps how the Mars-Saturn square is working. You either accept what this thing is, you try to understand it and you untangle it, or I suppose you could just ignore it and just pretend it doesn't exist, in which case it won't go away. So you do have a bit of choice, but I think the responsible thing to do is to confront the issue, and in many cases your charm will go a long way towards dissolving the problem. Libra. Libra, you benefit, I think, from a trine between the Moon and Venus. This trine between the Moon and Venus is, in a way, it's not particularly spectacular, but I do think that it's useful, and this trine is going to, I think, really help you to ground yourself and to simplify things. So if things have recently got a bit complicated, then I think this Moon trine Venus will allow you to sort of get back in touch with sort of material reality. And, when I say material reality, I'm perhaps not really talking so much about money, but more about the earth. We have to think about the earth on which we are living, on which we are dependent. And of course, this Moon trine Venus is in Earth signs, Moon in Capricorn, Venus in Virgo. Some Librans do have a certain issue with the Earth. The Earth can sometimes be crude, and the earthiness of life, the grime of life, the very fact that life is earthy and complicated, and of course it ends in the earth, doesn't it? We've got Mars square Saturn. It often ends in the earth. I suppose it depends. I suppose some cultures you get cremated, and other cultures you get buried. But there is a certain earthiness to the human existence that sometimes Librans try to pretend doesn't exist. But today, I think you are in tune with that, and I think it's going to be, quite a grounding experience. And I think all of us need a grounding experience, even if we're not Librans. But Libra in particular can see the Earth as perhaps an antidote to some of the complications going around us. We live in difficult times. Things are complicated, but one thing that doesn't change is the Earth on which we stand. And that Earth is going to be around long after all of this has died down. When all of us were dead and forgotten, the Earth will still be there. And so perhaps you could say, by tuning into the Earth, you're perhaps at some level perhaps tuning into your own immortality. And in terms of getting on with other people, I think that is very much something you can do, provided that you keep it as simple as possible. You don't want to have to worry about emotional complications, people's issues, people's frustrations. Just keeping it simple is really the way to go. And also be honest. Sometimes Librans don't like to be honest because it's just complicated, or it might seem complicated. You don't want to disturb the peace. But, very often Librans create a lot of trouble by trying to keep everyone happy. It's impossible to keep everyone happy. It really is. And if you try, it just makes matters even worse. And today you have the opportunity to be open and honest about what you believe, what you think, what's worrying you, and I think that your openness will be very appreciated. But I'm not talking about anything dramatic. It doesn't have to be super dramatic. You can just quietly tell someone how you feel and what your view is. And I think that in most cases that will be very much appreciated. I say in most cases, because there is today a square between Mars and Saturn, and while it's possible that square doesn't impact you, especially if you're fairly solitary, the more solitary you are, the less people around you, the less you'll be affected by that Mars square Saturn. But if you have to deal with people, that Mars square Saturn may start to make its influence felt, and you may be looking at people's behavior and perhaps be slightly concerned about it. I mean, it may be people you know, it may be people you observe, it may be people in the news, but it's just people are behaving in a way that doesn't feel right, and you can sense that there's a lot of frustration flying around, that people want things, people want to fly, literally or metaphorically. They want to go to different places. They want freedom, and they can't get it because circumstances are holding them up. And I suppose it's possible that if people feel that their freedom is being denied to them, that they can't do what they want to do, then they might take it out on you. I'm absolutely not saying it's going to happen, but you just might be there. And so if you do find that you're dealing with frustrating people who are also perhaps a little bit annoying, you should perhaps just sort of tell yourself that really it's not your problem, it is their problem. And when people are stuck, they just can behave in a somewhat unreasonable way. And from your perspective, it shouldn't bother you. And I suppose the best you can do is seek stability. Always seek stability today. Seek what makes you comfortable. And if something doesn't make you comfortable, or if a person doesn't make you feel comfortable, or a situation doesn't make you comfortable, then, Libra, it's absolutely fine to move on. In most cases, you don't have to explain yourself. You disappear in one place and you reappear somewhere else. But if you do have to explain yourself, I think you'll be very good at being to the point. You might not want to be to the point, but I think if you are to the point, I think that might be the quickest way to make things clear, simple, and uncomplicated. Scorpio. The big aspect today, Scorpio, is Mars square Saturn. And I do think it's important. And I think, Scorpio, it's very important that you're able to manage it and work out what it means and perhaps understand its pitfalls. Now, this Mars-Saturn square, it doesn't last forever. In a few days' time, you'll be thinking about something else. But right now, Scorpio, you just might feel that there are things that you'd like to be doing that basically you can't do. That might be one way of looking at it. Just a certain sense of frustration. But maybe also it could work the other way. There are things you are doing that you don't want to do. And so can you ever be satisfied? So if you're doing nothing, you'll feel that you should be doing something. If you're doing something, you're going to feel that you should be doing nothing. And so that could suggest a real sense of being generally dissatisfied. And I suppose, Scorpio, you maybe need to not dramatize things. Today is another day, and you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. that might be what you're tempted to do. And I buy eggs in one basket. I mean, really, your emotional eggs. Just putting all your emotions into one area and thinking that that is all there is, being very single-minded. And if you're single-minded about things, then I think that very soon there could be, a real sense of frustration, and that single-mindedness gets even worse if you're just taking something too seriously. And I think that might be it, Scorpio. If you take anything too seriously today, then it could be overwhelming. And of course, I do understand that Scorpio is a serious sign and it likes to do things properly. But it's almost like you have to take this Mars-Saturn square and almost act in the opposite way. So at the first instance, Mars-Saturn square is suggesting a serious approach, an approach which, almost deals with matters of life and death. Nothing can be trivialized. But I'm not saying that you should laugh at the Mars-Saturn square. It is serious in its own way, but you don't want to take it too seriously. And perhaps you should just try to just enjoy yourself in a gentle way. And if there's something you absolutely feel you need to do and it's really bothering you today, maybe you shouldn't do it today. Okay, some things I understand do have to be done, but maybe you should just put it off. Find some space to just relax and be yourself, and just not to get too worried about it. And I think also, Scorpio, there is a bit of pressure on you to be creative in your own way. I mean, that's what I was saying. If you're doing nothing, you feel a sense of frustration because you should be doing something. And if you're doing something, you'd prefer to be doing nothing. But there is a little bit of pressure on you to be creative. And if there's a danger that if you take something like creativity, we always think creativity, it's this great word that means so many different things. And the trouble about creativity is it can mean so many things that it means absolutely nothing. But I'm not talking about creativity in any trivial sense. I'm talking about something not just that you're good at, but something you also enjoy, that you can bring together ability and fun. And if you can do that, but not in such a serious way, just do it just because you're enjoying yourself, then I think that things should be okay, and you'll be untangling some of the complications of the Mars-Saturn square. At the same time, you should not forget about other people, because one aspect we've got today, which is actually quite a nice aspect, is Moon trine Venus. And this Moon trine Venus, I think, is going to have an impact on your relationships, and I think quite a fortunate impact. It actually allows you to have easygoing connections with lots of different people. Okay, I don't want to exaggerate, but not just one person, but lots of different people. And it's not about achieving a huge amount. It's just about being with people, talking to people, and perhaps listening to what other people have to say. If you're talking about your own material, that could be exhausting. Even if you're talking about your own achievements and the achievements of your family, your loved ones, telling people how great they are, I don't think that's going to be very satisfying. If you can just relax and listen to someone else talking about their achievements, listen to someone else talking about their material, you don't have to say much. You can just listen. And, when you're bored, you can talk to someone else. But I think that might be quite relaxing, just to be with people and not feel any pressure, not feel any great need to say anything special. May just be small talk. I don't know. Some Scorpios are perhaps not particularly enthused by the idea of small talk, but just gentle conversation, even if it's gentle prattle, it's just going to be a way to sort of dissolve the power of the Mars-Saturn square. And I know that one could try to be heavy about the Mars-Saturn square and say, well, Mars-Saturn square is all about structuring yourself, and you've got to be disciplined with that Mars-Saturn square. But I don't think that's what you want to hear, and I think you know that already. And I don't think structure and discipline are things that right now I don't think they're things that you actually have any problems with, at least at the moment. Sagittarius, you are in a state of mind where you are thinking about what you have and what you don't have. And if you don't have something, I think that you're going to be very aware that you don't have it. And you may be thinking that there is just some huge lack in your life. But there's no need to exaggerate. I think at the moment, if there is something that you feel is missing, particularly of a material nature, then there are steps you can take to get it. And you can get it without really stressing yourself, just by being easygoing, but also fairly focused, concentrating on what matters, and also concentrating on the people that matter. It's not a day for spending your time alone. You don't have to be alone. There are people out there who can give you what you want, or at least they can help you get what you want. So consider what's missing right now, particularly in a material sense, and see if there isn't a way of getting it. And that missing thing, it could be, I suppose it could be money, it could be something like a spare part, it could be something very physical, something you need, some piece of equipment you need, something that would make your life easier and more satisfying. Whatever it is, there is a way to get hold of it, and you can get hold of it just by talking to people, seeing what's available, making phone calls, using your social skills. It can all be done. And overall, Sagittarius, I do think that people are very much going to notice you, and they'll listen to what you say, and I think in most cases that they will give you what you want. Now, it is true that there is a square between Mars and Saturn today, and this Mars-Saturn square could affect everyone, regardless of their sign, and I suppose it could affect you. And I suppose Mars is in Gemini, and Mars is quite close to the conjunction of Jupiter, and so we've got Mars-Jupiter conjunction. In fact, we had the Mars-Jupiter conjunction on Wednesday. So today we've got Saturn square Mars, and as you know, on Monday we've got Jupiter square Saturn. So you could say that your Jupiter is under a little bit of pressure over the next few days, and because of that pressure, you just may be aware of certain people, certain situations which do bother you, and you have to ask yourself how you're going to deal with it. It may not be about today, even though there is a Mars-Saturn square. It's just over the next few days, situations that are not just difficult, it may seem a bit over your head, and you just don't know how to respond. So what do you do? Well, you shouldn't forget that Sagittarius is a sign relating to movement. It does move from one place to another very quickly. That's what it can do. I suppose one image of Sagittarius is a sort of it's a flame that just moves across. It just moves across the landscape quickly. It doesn't stay in one place for too long. And so perhaps with movement, Sagittarius, you can just get round the problem, and it's like an obstacle course, isn't it? Maybe that's it. I think that over the next few days, things are a bit of an obstacle course. There are plenty of things and people trying to slow you down, trying to divert you, trying to frustrate you. But you're a Sagittarius, you can be quick. And perhaps you mustn't forget your key strength, Sagittarius. It's about not overthinking, just working on the basis of your intuition, what feels right. I suppose if you want to take a sort of a Star Wars analogy, maybe it's let the force be with you, or whatever it is. I mean, that's a very sort of Sagittarian concept, the force, something that's with you that doesn't have to be analysed. And it doesn't have to be made to be too sophisticated. Just find this path for yourself. And if you find the path for yourself, you'll get through and you'll be able to avoid the pitfalls. But I'm not saying that you should trivialize what's going on. There are things going on that are capable of bringing you to a halt. And perhaps what will bring you to a halt is too much thinking. As soon as you spend too much time analysing something, you could say that it's got you and you're in its trap. Yeah, a bit of analysis, 1 second of analysis, but let your intuition do the work. Let this sort of higher force guide you through. And then Sagittarius, I think that you should be okay. And I suppose what we perhaps have here also is a little bit of a contradiction. You know, I said at the beginning of this piece for Sagittarius that you got Moon trine Venus, and I think that Moon trine Venus is a nice sociable aspect that you can certainly benefit to some extent from other people. But on the other hand, remember I'm talking about these things trying to drag you off the path, trying to tempt you, trying to distract you, trying to make you analyze them too much. I mean, that could also be people. So in terms of people, just don't linger. I think that's the point. Don't linger. And if you don't linger, you'll be able to benefit from people rather than being held up by them. Capricorn, it's perhaps quite an important day. I mean, you've got the moon moving through your sign. I mean, the moon is right in the middle of Capricorn, and so in a way it's a day when you are in tune with yourself. You basically understand what's happening, and you understand what could go wrong, but you also understand the opportunities. And I think overall you're actually very realistic, and you're not given to flights of fantasy. And at the same time, yeah, if there is an opportunity, you'll be able to analyze this opportunity and almost certainly be able to make the most of it. And I think you'll be helped by the fact that you'll be very effective in terms of social interaction. It's because you'll be able to talk about things that other people regard as important. You won't seem trivial. You won't seem like like a flake talking about stuff that is totally uninteresting and irrelevant. You will be able to stick to the point and because you're able to stick to the point, people are going to like you, and they're going to want to spend time talking to you, and it's going to be a two-way process. I think that through talking to other people, you can benefit and they can benefit, and there is going to be something of a learning process. So plenty of opportunities today to learn about what people are doing, learn about how best to do things, and if you're interested in things connected with business, I think it could also be an effective day, because you have a chance to discover that there are new ways of doing things. And it's not just business. I suppose it can relate to your career. If you have a career, if that's relevant. I mean, I understand you might be retired, but if you are working today, don't assume that your current way of working is the only way of doing it. There may be a particular task you're doing, or a particular responsibility you have to fulfill, and you may think that there's only one way of doing it, but there may actually be several ways of doing it. And doing some extra reading and learning, it could be quite important. I mean, in general, it is a time, I think, when Capricorns can benefit from learning and study. I mean, I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again at the moment. So don't dismiss that opportunity, and don't rest on your laurels. Don't think that you know everything. There are still things that you could learn about, and it won't take very much time to fill yourself in with the key information. And perhaps it's also about updating yourself. Every now and then you do need to update yourself. Things change, technology changes, attitudes change, and by updating yourself, you'll be helping yourself. Now, one aspect that is happening today that really can't be ignored is the square between Mars and Saturn. I mean, it has to be relevant to you, Capricorn, because Saturn is your ruler and Mars is square Saturn. So if Mars is square Saturn, that might be indicative of an irritation. Now, the irritation might be just about one thing you're doing, you have to do, you're obliged to do, and you do it, and it just becomes really annoying. And something you thought was going to be really easy turns out to be frustratingly difficult, and almost to the point where you kind of want to lose your temper. And I think that perhaps you just have to accept that it might take a little longer than expected. You thought it was going to be easy, you've done it before, it was easy, but this time round it's not easy. And it's holding you up, and it's taking up a lot of your time. Well, if you don't get angry about it, and if you accept that this is a bit of a problem, then it's going to take up less of your time. And maybe the thing is that if you do run into a problem today, particularly if it's some organizational, administrative, routine problem, or you're involved in, you're trying to make something or fix something, and you start to run into a problem, your first impulse might be to just keep going, to keep banging your head against this problem. But instead, the easy approach, or rather the best approach, is to step back and ask some questions, consider the possibility that you don't fully understand the situation, and then get the help you need. Now, getting the help you need might be about reading something, or it could be just having a quick phone call. And it's not what you want to do, because your natural impulse will be just to keep plugging away in the same old way, because it should be easy. But that could take a long time. But if instead you just change what you're doing, get some help, ask some questions, read something, then you'll be able to look at the problem in a new way. and you'll perhaps actually realize that you've got something wrong, and now you know what to do. You should be able to deal with the thing pretty quickly. So don't allow frustration to build up. The moment you start to feel frustrated doing something, the moment you feel that, then that is the time to change your approach. Perhaps to get the information, and then you get the information you need, and then I'm fairly confident that things should resolve themselves, and I think resolve themselves pretty quickly. And really, Capricorn, I don't think there is a great deal to say, though I suppose I should say something about health with Mars square Saturn. I think that Mars square Saturn can affect everyone's health, regardless of their sign. Mars square Saturn, you can associate that with accidents. If we're getting angry about something, then that anger transfers into incorrect behavior or sloppy behavior or hasty behavior, and perhaps we could do ourselves an injury. But that Mars square Saturn just may indicate that you put too much physical energy into something. We may be talking about a repetitive action. Just something, I don't know, you could be digging, or, for example, just something repetitive. And that repetitive action could, for example, have some muscular issue. That's one possibility. You don't stop, and you realize some part of your body has been overused, and that's a possibility. So don't allow yourself to sort of physically do the same thing for too long, and particularly if it's of a repetitive nature. I don't know. It could be, something in the kitchen, it could be something in the garden, or it could be just something else, but it's something that has the potential to cause short-term aggravation. So that's a small point about your health, but just take it easy, don't exaggerate, and I think that things should be okay. Aquarius, it's probably a day when you shouldn't really feel that you actually have to do anything, and you should perhaps put things on hold. There's no harm in delay. Does it really have to be done right now? And at the same time, things at times just may be a little bit difficult. And why stress yourself out today on something that you're not going to necessarily be able to do a good job on, when if you waited a few days, maybe you wait until next week, I think that things actually could be easier. But if you are in the mood to really get involved with something, you feel it's important, it's got to be done today, then I think you do have to accept that it's going to take longer than usual, and is going to take more energy than usual, and you can't have expectations really about anything being particularly easy, and you will certainly want to do a good job. I think there is a sense, Aquarius, today, that you are a perfectionist, and perhaps that's the problem. If you do something, you're going to want it to be perfect, almost perfect, and of course perfection is going to be quite an impossible ideal. It can't be found, perfection, and it's just enough to do your best, but even then your best might not be good enough. So Aquarius, I think that it just might be a good idea not to do anything that is super important, and instead probably the best use of today is to just do some sort of quiet contemplation, consideration. Start to evaluate your feelings and evaluate your stance. I mean, you have a stance, you have an understanding of what's happening in the world, and sometimes things are so hectic that you don't have a chance to reconsider. And now today might actually be a good day for reconsidering, maybe with the help of someone else. You know, it's perhaps a good time to perhaps have a serious conversation about something. Not serious as in you and someone are in a conflicted situation, but you just want to talk about serious subjects because it is a serious day and there are serious things going on in the world. And by discussing the serious things going on in the world, I suppose it doesn't have to be face to face. I mean, I suppose it could be on the internet, it could be on some chat or Facebook or however you want to discuss things. This just allows you, I think, Aquarius, to just get some broad perspective on things and just not feel that you really need to be pressured right now. And so that's probably the best way of handling things. And, you know, I have to say that, yeah, there is a square between Mars and Saturn. And Saturn is a ruler of Aquarius, so you could say that if Mars is square Saturn, then there are aggravating influences. And I think that is why I'm suggesting today, Aquarius, that you don't really try to do too much, particularly try to do too much that's important, because if you do try to do important stuff, you may feel aggravated and you may not be entirely sympathetic to the way other people are trying to do something. You're trying to do something, perhaps you're trying to do the same thing that someone else is trying to achieve, and you're looking at how they're doing it and you're not happy about it. And there could be, I suppose, there's a potential for creative disagreement and, you know, differing priorities. And the more important everyone thinks it is, the more the problems are going to start to pile up. So, you know, it is the end of a week. It's Friday. Does anything really have to achieve? So, does anything really have to be achieved? And I think that in most cases, the answer, Aquarius, is probably no. Pisces, you're quite a friendly, pleasant person at the moment. You're not going to particularly rock the boat, and I think as you go about the world doing whatever you have to do, I think that your interactions with other people are going to be fortunate. I mean, not super fortunate. I'm not saying it's a massively exciting day, but it's a day when things generally for you, I think, will run relatively smoothly. Though, you know, do keep an open mind. That is important. The reason you need to keep an open mind is that there could be new people that just appear out of the woodwork. You didn't know they existed and suddenly they appear, and that might be interesting. But you don't have to certainly worry about it. I suppose you could say, if you meet a new person, someone you've never met before, or at least someone you've perhaps met before, but you haven't understood them, you haven't understood what kind of a person they are, there is the possibility of being surprised, maybe a little bit disturbed, but I don't think it's really necessary to be disturbed, because what's disturbing you is just seeing something for the first time, you know, perhaps realizing what someone is like for the first time. But surely, Pisces, you know, variety, as they say, is really important. And if you don't have variety, you know, things do get in the end boring. And so perhaps in terms of your social life and all your friends and all your contacts, there needs to be a little bit of turnover here. It's more about bringing new people in rather than distancing yourself from old people. So some positive and constructive social turnover should, I think, be something to be welcomed. And consider also, Pisces, your own boundaries. I think that today, Pisces, your boundaries may be a little strong. You perhaps are picking up on the Mars-Saturn square. I know I've been going on and on about this Mars-Saturn square, but I think you're picking up on it a little, and you're perhaps thinking with this Mars-Saturn square that certain things could be testing your boundaries. You just may be aware that some people are just going a bit too far, starting to take a few liberties, or you may even just think they might be about to take a few liberties. They may be about to go too far, and perhaps they're getting a bit too close to your red lines. But I think it's important that you don't exaggerate the situation. It's just that you are very aware of your boundaries. It's almost like that your defensive mechanisms, the barbed wire and the electric fences, it's all, the sensitivity is turned up to maximum. That just might be how it feels. That's how a lot of people feel, I think, with that Mars square Saturn. So it is important to give people a chance, because you need to give people a chance to be able to tune into your basic friendliness. And I think today you can be very friendly, as I said right at the beginning, as I suggested right at the beginning of this piece. We do have Moon trine Venus. It's a very nice aspect, but I suppose that Moon trine Venus is in Earth signs, and Moon is in Capricorn, which is in its detriment. Venus is in Virgo. It's in its fall. So I think with that Moon trine Venus, it's somewhat transactional, and so I suppose if you're having to deal with someone and your defense mechanisms are sort of on alert, you perhaps have to ask yourself, what do you want and what does the other person want? And the sooner you find out what someone wants, the easier it is to relax, because once you know what someone wants, you can trust them. You can trust them to do what you expect. For example, if you know that someone wants to, someone knocking on your door trying to sell you an overpriced product, at least you know what they want. To an extent, you can trust them because you know why they're there. But if you don't know why someone is there, it's really difficult to know how to respond. And so your defense mechanisms are going to remain on maximum. But I'm probably exaggerating. I think that in most cases, Pisces, I think that your ability to just get on with people and to enjoy their company is going to be very good, and probably you don't have to ask too many questions. Okay, those are my forecasts for the 12 signs, and now I want to look at the I Ching. So what I asked is, what is Friday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was number 2, the receptive. Now we've had this quite recently, and I think perhaps we should see the receptive in terms of what is going on astrologically. Today there is this square between Mars and Saturn, which I've been going on and on about, and I will continue to go on and on about it in my description of a Mars-Saturn square after I've done I Ching. And it can be a very difficult energy, this Mars-Saturn square, and it might make us feel frustrated, we might feel there's nothing we can do. We might have worries about the future. It just might feel that things are just not going right. But the receptive is about not putting any input in. Look, all of the lines are broken. It's about responding. It's about observing. It's not feeling that we have to take the initiative. And so, with Mars square Saturn, do we really want to take the initiative? Possibly not, because if we take the initiative with Mars, Mars is about force, it's about energy, it's about assertion, and Saturn is about restriction. If we do take the initiative, we could just get bogged down. We could get really annoyed with ourselves. We could get annoyed with other people, but just be the receptive. Just let the whole thing flow over us. Let's just watch it. Not feel that we have to do anything. Not feel that we have to put any input out there. No input is required, I don't think. Just let it happen. And that way, by taking a fairly passive approach, we are sort of restricting the possibility for bad things to happen. Because I think, in a way, the bad things are more likely to happen to people who actually take the initiative. And we've got two moving lines. The second line moves, the third line moves. And with the second line moving, it's just telling us just not to feel we have to do anything. There is a natural flow to things. And that's what the receptive is about, this natural flow. And we just have to become part of that natural flow. It's not about our egos. It's not us trying to interfere with that flow or think we know best or trying to show off or thinking this flow can be diverted. It can't. And just by going with nature, then that is the way forward. And in fact, the I Ching perhaps goes further in a more sort of practical sense. It is better to obey rather than to give orders. Okay, we can't just obey mindlessly, of course, but provided the orders are reasonable, the instructions are reasonable, just by being obedient, that's the way forward. I suppose if you're in an institution or an organization, or you're living in a totalitarian state, it's best to just obey. Of course, totalitarian states, we're getting more and more more and more totalitarian states. From what I hear, Britain is becoming a totalitarian state in terms of restrictions on freedom of speech. That's one thing I do really appreciate about the US, and that is the First Amendment. First Amendment might not be perfect, but it's a lot better than what people are having to deal with in the UK. So if you're in the UK, with this hexagram, the receptive, just go with the flow, obey. Yeah, you might not like to obey the Starmer government, but today perhaps you should just obey. Don't complain. Don't write controversial things on Facebook, for example. Don't tweet your wild and controversial ideas. Just follow the rules, and it's going to be fine. Then the third line from the bottom moves, and the third line does highlight the fact that we are clever, and we've got some really good ideas, and we just feel that we have absolutely got something to contribute, something important to contribute, and I think we have. But it's not the right time. It's not the right time to talk about it. It's not the right time to reveal it. It's not the right time to make ourselves out to be different. And so it's important to keep it secret, keep it to ourselves. We're not supposed to put our head above the parapet. That's not what it's about. We don't want to stand out. Isn't that what they say? The nail that sticks out gets knocked down. That's perhaps what we should remember. and at the moment, today, and just perhaps we can focus in a quite quiet, secretive way in terms of what we're good at, but it's just not the right time because it is a receptive. It's more about obeying rather than giving orders. It's about being part of the collective, not standing out as individuals. I mean, it's only for today, don't worry. And then anyway, the receptive does move because we have two moving lines, and it moves to hexagram number 46, which is pushing upwards. And pushing upwards suggests that having gone through that sort of discipline of perhaps controlling ourselves, not trying to be an individual, just following the collective, things actually start to move. We can actually start to, in the end, make progress. And it's not that we're necessarily going to achieve the end result straight away, but we will be making good progress. And so we can be confident that we're going to get an increasing amount of support from other people. We may get some recognition. It's not recognition that we've asked for. It's recognition that we're just given because of who we are. So we don't have to, make any special effort here. Just we move forward in our own way, and it's all very natural. And at a later stage, perhaps we can be rewarded for our modesty. It's keeping things to ourselves, and not trying to stick out. But in the end, it does work out, and the cautious approach that was connected with the previous hexagram, the receptive, I think will eventually be rewarded. Okay, so I want to look at Mars square Saturn, and there is, of course, a Mars-Saturn square today. I mean, in a previous video, I've talked about how this Mars-Saturn square is likely to impact the world at large. That's not really what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about perhaps more what it means in a horoscope. But just a reminder of the Mars-Saturn square. This is the Mars-Saturn square that takes place today, London time. It's at 6:30 a.m. in the morning, and there it is. Mars is at 1742 Gemini, and Saturn is at 1742 Pisces. And I think it could be quite a dangerous day, not necessarily on an individual note, but perhaps more about the collective. And there could be events of a Mars-Saturn nature. And I suppose we have to remember that Mars-Saturn is, it's often connected with death. I mean, particularly in sort of older traditional astrology, that pair is seen as being really quite difficult. And as far as the horoscope is concerned, it can be about frustration. I mean, that is absolutely logical, isn't it? I mean, if you've got Mars is how you're trying to assert yourself, and it runs into Saturn. It is frustrating. We have to really find some way of using that energy in a constructive way. And sometimes, when you have people with Mars-Saturn aspects, you perhaps have to suggest that they find some healthy way of using that energy. I mean, very often, one can suggest maybe martial arts if that's appropriate. I mean, martial arts can, of course, be dangerous, and you need to be fit and healthy for that. Or, I don't know, if in music, there are some drummers who have Mars-Saturn aspects. That makes sense, doesn't it? You need to drumming to get that energy out. And it is frustrating, and it can be about pain, and it can be about a wound. I mean, I know we think about Chiron and wounds, but Mars-Saturn can be about wounds, something that is incredibly painful. And it can literally be about death. And it can be not that someone is going to have an early death, but perhaps someone is very tuned in to the concept of death, and thoughts of death and mortality may well have a big influence. Though, many people, most people, they have Mars-Saturn squares, and it's fine. They lead their lives, and nothing bad happens. But in terms of the horoscopes I'm going to look at, of course, these are very, very subjective horoscopes. These are horoscopes that I find interesting. And so I keep saying that, but you just always have to remember that. I'm looking at charts I find interesting. They're not necessarily charts that you find interesting. So I want to look at Mars-Saturn, and I want to start by looking at my grandfather. Now, I know you're not really interested in my grandfather, but I thought I should look at his chart. I think it was his birthday quite recently. So here's a chart of my grandfather. So my grandfather, it was his birthday just a couple of days ago. He was born on August the 12th, 1890. And my grandfather has had a Mars-Saturn square. And in fact, it's quite a tight Mars-Saturn square. I don't have a time of birth for my grandfather. And so clearly, I would have said, something is not right there with my grandfather, especially as my grandfather had a Neptune-Pluto conjunction, because he was born in 1890, August the 12th, 1890, and he was born with an exact Mars opposition Pluto and an exact Mars-Neptune opposition, and it's square Saturn. So there is some pain here. There surely has to be some pain here. And so in terms of my interpretation of it, in terms of my understanding of my grandfather, I would have said that the Neptune-Pluto conjunction is very, very collective. It's generational. It has to be generational. And of course, him being born on August the 12th, 1890, he is, of course, part of a generation that fought in the First World War. Now, he didn't fight in the First World War. He had a good education. He went to Eton and Trinity College, Cambridge, and he went into he trained to be an Anglican priest, and so he spent, as far as I understand it, he spent the First World War, or part of the First World War, sort of, I think he went to whatever theological college, and I think he became a curate, and that's what he did. And he didn't become a chaplain, as he might, I suppose he could have done, as far as I understand. I always used to think he was a chaplain in the army, but no, or in the armed forces. But no, as far as I understand, he didn't, and he was in a parish through the First World War. So you could say, well, he got out of the First World War. There wasn't a problem there. Unfortunately, he had a younger brother, and his younger brother, like him, went to Eton and Trinity College, Cambridge, and then he joined the army, and his younger brother didn't last very long. His younger brother was killed on May the 10th, 1915, and so I think that was the Second Battle of Ypres. And okay, you could say big deal. I mean, a whole generation of people in England and in Germany, they had of this age group were being killed, or their relatives were being killed. But okay, I'm looking at his chart, and he's my grandfather, and so I'm trying to relate this event to him. And there is no doubt that the death of his younger brother had a devastating impact on him, and I think that you can see this in the Mars-Saturn square, and also you can actually see this in terms of his behaviour after the war. That he apparently during the First World War, just after the First World War, he'd go to great effort to go to places and to erect plaques to his younger brother. and in a church, because his parents, my great grandparents, my great grandfather, he was also a priest. So a church where he'd been at, there's a little plaque to my great uncle, my great uncle Harry, who was killed in 19. That was who he was. Harry, he was killed in 1915. And so there's a plaque to him, and it says that my grandfather placed this plaque, and so it was. I would guess there's a certain amount of guilt here, because he was supposed to look after his younger brother, and also he wasn't involved in the war. And I think he decided to be a priest. He wasn't even a chaplain. I suppose so. There may be just a huge feeling of guilt, and that's linked up with the Mars-Saturn square, and I think also with this with this Mars-Saturn square, it just carries on, and you have to think of it, or perhaps in a generational sense. My mother was saying he never talked about it. This was a subject which, of course, was never talked about, and of course, this was a feature of the First World War. In any war, people involved in wars don't talk about things, but it's perhaps there's a sense of a skeleton here, and if something is not talked about, of course, that sort of builds up, and you've got the sort of it's always a part of his life. And I didn't really know my grandfather very well, because he was 7 when I was 7 when he died. But that's a suggestion of how the Mars-Saturn square might have worked. Now, I've got the chart of the day in which my great uncle Harry was killed. Now, the great advantage in this First World War is that if you were an officer, he was a second lieutenant, my grandfather. And a big advantage of being a second lieutenant is that in terms of regimental diaries, if you were just an NCO or a private and you got killed, you were just a number. They would say, 5 privates were killed, a sergeant was killed, or whatever. But if you're an officer, you at least got named in the regimental diary when you got killed. And so the death of so in terms of my great uncle's death, so he was killed, I think, in the Second Battle of Ypres, I believe, on May the 10th, 1915, and this is the time of birth. Now, there's no Mars-Saturn here. There's nothing that I found immediately impressive about this Mars-Saturn square. It didn't seem to reflect, but it did actually link with solar arc directions. So, by the way, in terms of the death, I think you can see in a regimental diary there was a lot of fighting, and one officer was wounded, and so my great uncle had to take over, and so he had this moment where he had taken over on the battle, and he was in charge, and then a few hours later he was killed. I don't know, but they never found his body. He's just part of a name on the Menem memorial. And in terms of solar arc directions, it's kind of quite interesting with the Mars-Saturn. You can see that my grandfather had Mars. Well, it sort of fits actually, because you can see that my grandfather had a Mars-Neptune opposition that was square Saturn. And so that means that by solar arc direction, if you direct everything 1 degree per year, by May the 10th, by 1915, Mars had directed onto the Aries point, onto the solstice point, and Neptune had directed onto the solstice axis. So Neptune had directed onto 0 degrees Cancer, and Mars had directed onto 0 degrees Capricorn. So in a way, the solstice point represents the collective, the world at large. So that direction onto the world at large really made that Mars-Neptune happen. And of course, that Mars-Neptune was also square his Saturn. So I think by solar arc directions, I think we do see something going on. But going back to the moment of the death, one thing I do find interesting about this, perhaps revealing, is that you have got Jupiter-Chiron conjunction. So that this Jupiter conjunction in Chiron, sorry, this Jupiter conjunction in Pisces is exact. 15-minute orb. Really, really close Jupiter-Chiron conjunction at the time of my great uncle's death. And so this was the time when my grandfather lost a male relative. And really, really close Jupiter-Chiron conjunction, 15-minute orb. And I just noticed that today or yesterday, and I was quite shocked by it. And now the reason I was kind of shocked and surprised by it was the fact that, my grandfather, he lost a male relative on May the 10th, 1915. And so he gained a male relative on May the 30th, 1962, when I was born. And I have an exact Jupiter-Chiron conjunction in my chart. You can see that it's really close in Pisces. So there is a kind of a link between my birth and the death of my great uncle 47 years earlier. I mean, you may say that's just a coincidence, and of course, it's a bit overindulgent. You don't really want to know about me and my family connections and what that actually means, but I think that's just something to consider, and that somehow, I suppose, when you're talking about grandfather mourning his brother, that has an impact on his family. It has an impact on my mother, for example, having a father who has got this skeleton, this mourning his brother, this really having a real impact on him. And then I suppose she picks it up, and then I pick it up, and so that might be how it connects. So that's one possibility. But anyway, my apologies for going on and on about my family history, and that's just completely indulgent of me, so I'm really sorry about that. Okay, so what I now want to talk about is some real famous people who have got Mars-Saturn squares, and the first one that comes to mind is Albert Pierpoint. So Albert Pierpoint was a celebrated British executioner. He hanged a lot of the war criminals in the after the Second World War, and everyone thought he was great. And you can see he was an Aries. He was very famous for being quick in his executions. The idea was that he would, you can see in the picture on the thumbnail, he's smoking a cigar, and of course what he would do is, he would put his cigar down on the ashtray as he would execute someone, and they would be dead in 15 seconds. And he had it. It was a real art, and as far as he was concerned. And there is his Mars square Saturn. So Mars in Scorpio, it's a strong Mars. I don't have a time of birth for him, so it's a strong Mars in Scorpio, and it's very powerful. It needs a way to sort of exercise itself. But you can see the frustration potentially of Saturn. But Saturn is in Saturn is in Aquarius. So Saturn is in its own sign in Aquarius. So Mars is in its own sign in Scorpio. And so where do all the frustrations of the Mars-Saturn square, where do they manifest? Well, I think his father was an executioner as well. So he's using that Mars-Saturn square, you could say, in a constructive way. He's using it in terms of executions, in terms of killing people. And again, he was supposed to be very good at his job. People died quickly. And you can see, there's a film, you can certainly see the trailer on YouTube of Pierpoint, but the great thing about the film is it really demonstrates on the film how quickly he killed people, and how good at his job he was. So that's one way in which you can be effective in terms of using the Mars-Saturn square. Someone who used the Mars-Saturn square in a more destructive way was German terrorist Andreas Baader, as of Baader and the Baader-Meinhof gang. He was very concerned about injustice in the world. To begin with, he was concerned about injustice in Germany. The Baader-Meinhof gang also were very concerned about injustice in Palestine. So does anything change? People were concerned about that in the early 70s and late 60s. And that was part of what he felt he was fighting for in terms of his urban terrorism. And so there you can see he's got Mars in Pisces, square Saturn in Gemini. So again, Mars in Pisces, I suppose, it's quite sensitive, Mars in Pisces. It does, you could say, well, it does feel the suffering of the world around him. And so you could say that, and square Saturn, it's not, you have to do something about it. What are you going to do about it? And so he starts by going to protests, and then he gets involved with the Baader-Meinhof gang, he created the Baader-Meinhof gang, and then he gets involved with other people. I think he was the only member of the Baader-Meinhof gang who didn't have a degree. A lot of them had PhDs. They were all very sort of educated people, but so that's how he used the sensitivity of that Mars in Pisces. Saturn, he does become an urban terrorist. So that's how that works. And then there is Boris. Boris has a Mars-Saturn square. So Boris Johnson, former British Prime Minister, and he kind of fools us there, didn't he? We thought he didn't have a Mars-Saturn square. He came over, as mayor of London when he was when he won before the 2019 election. He was just the optimist. That's what people liked about him, this bumbling optimist, and particularly as mayor of London, that's what people voted him for. But all this depression about Brexit and whatever, he wanted to see the best in things, and we didn't see the Mars-Saturn square. But it's a kind of a deceptive chart, Boris Johnson's chart. You see the Gemini, but you don't see the moon at 0 degrees Scorpio, or the Mars in Gemini square Saturn. And I think that in terms of how we started to see that was when he became Prime Minister. Because when he became Prime Minister, he had to deal with the whole COVID epidemic. And I suppose being Prime Minister at a time of pandemic, when people are dying and people are suffering, okay, you could say they're dying of COVID, you could say they're suffering because of restrictions, whatever. But it's kind of fitting that the Prime Minister of a country that is either got this pandemic or is dealing with this pandemic, it's kind of fitting that the Prime Minister should have a Mars-Saturn square. And it's not just Mars-Saturn square, it's actually Mars square Uranus as well. And so that Mars needs to express itself. And then, having got through COVID, we have the whole Ukraine issue. And as we know, Boris was an active advocate of massive intervention in Ukraine, encouraging Ukraine to fight for as long as possible. When Ukraine had was talking to the Russians in Istanbul in the spring of 2022, they almost had a deal, but it said that Boris and other NATO leaders, but I think it was particularly Boris, pressurized Ukraine to pull out of the deal. And as a result of that, the war continued, and another 500,000 plus Ukrainians died. That's a lot of death. I mean, not to mention the extra Russians who died. And so that might be how his Mars-Saturn square was working. So, I mean, that's a bit disturbing. He has these inner psychological frustrations that we don't see on the surface, but he's living them out, and he finds a way to utilize this Mars-Saturn square by getting Britain involved in this war with Ukraine and actually hundreds of thousands of people dying. So I think in a way, the Mars-Saturn square is kind of working, isn't it, with Boris? And talking about Ukraine, I suppose if you're Canadian, you might be interested to know that your Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, has a Mars-Saturn square. There's her Mars, a rather difficult Mars at, it's at 28 Capricorn. I mean, with that Mars at 28 Capricorn, traditionally Mars is exalted. Sorry, Cancer. Mars is exalted. Its degree of maximum exaltation is 28. Is 28 Capricorn. So you could say that 28 Cancer is just about the worst place for Mars to be in. I know that's a sort of that sort of approach is used in Vedic astrology as well, but sort of more so than in Western astrology. But it's a pretty bad Mars, and it's square Saturn, which is Saturn in Aries. So Aries is Saturn in Aries. Aries is fallen. Two very difficult malefics in square with each other, and this perhaps indicates someone who, sure, she's been successful in politics, but as far as I understand, her influence in Canadian politics has been very negative. And of course, like Boris, she's an enthusiastic supporter of NATO's intervention in Ukraine, and of course, she is part Ukrainian herself, and basically I think her grandfather was involved in what was going on in Europe at the time, the Banderite, with Stepan Banda, and that's supporting Ukrainian nationalism and getting support from Nazi Germany. So she's got a really bad history, hasn't she? And it's being brought out in her role as being Deputy Prime Minister. So I don't think that Mars-Saturn square is particularly pleasant. And again, as with Boris, in her own way, she's helping to fuel a war, which is leading to people getting killed. And maybe there are other aspects to her politically, but I don't know. I don't really know much about Canadian politics. And on the theme of Nazism, one of the most notorious Nazis, Joseph Mengele, who was infamous for his experimentation in concentration camps, had Mars in Aquarius square Saturn in Taurus. Of course, he was a doctor who was SS doctor in a concentration camp doing experiments. You could say that's Mars in Aquarius. In some perverse way, Mars in Aquarius, you could say, well, that's kind of curious, isn't it? Experiments with prisoners, and Mars square Saturn. So that's perhaps Mars square Saturn at its absolute worst. And going right back, Emperor Nero, fiddling while Rome burnt. His first 5 years in office were actually okay as emperor, but after 5 years he flipped, and so he was born as sort of 37 AD. There's his Mars at 26 Sagittarius, square Saturn in Virgo, and in the end he became a nightmare, and to an extent he sort of lost his sanity, and he has his, I don't know what about his frustration. Mars in Sagittarius, he wanted to be he liked being a musician, didn't he? He liked to perform in public, and it was not the done thing for an emperor of Rome to be involving himself in music. But maybe that's Mars in Sagittarius. He wants to be free. He wants to be able to be creative. But then there's square Saturn, and of course he's associated with all sorts of deaths. I suppose he killed according to the story, he killed his own mother. I think there's this I think Suetonius describes his mother drowning in a lake, and he pushed her off, and the oarsmen were pushing her away, and so he killed. According to the story, he killed his own mother, and in the end, the whole thing collapsed, and he committed suicide. And so that's one example of how Mars Saturn square might be working. I suppose at its worst. And if you do have Mars square Saturn, you may be attracted to difficult and dangerous situations, like Daniel Pearl. I think Daniel Pearl was a journalist who was kidnapped in Pakistan and murdered. It was a long time ago, 2002. But so he had Mars in Scorpio, square Saturn. So if you've got Mars square Saturn, you should perhaps avoid doing dangerous things. So if you have Mars square Saturn and you become a journalist and you have meetings in Pakistan and you're trying to interact with Al Qaeda in terms of sorting out a news story, I mean, is that really the right thing to do? So I think he perhaps should have been more careful with his Mars square Saturn. Now, one person who perhaps was able to, or is able to, use his Mars square Saturn effectively is the president of El Salvador. Now, he's still alive, and the president of El Salvador, he was, you can see he's got an exact Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. Exact. He was born on a day of a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, and there's his Mars at 4 degrees 1 Capricorn. Now, on the surface, you could say, well, that is difficult, isn't it? I mean, the moon is actually sextile his Mars, but in his case, he's been really successful. So I think he came from a sort of immigrant family. I think his family originally from Lebanon, and they moved to El Salvador. And I think he had a car dealership, and then he became mayor of San Salvador, and then he became president. And he has been a very effective president, I think. And aside from making Bitcoin one of the currencies, one of El Salvador's currencies, and apparently it's doing quite well, Bitcoin, at the moment. Things can change. But it's what he did with crime. And so Mars square Saturn maybe has a brutality to it. And perhaps that's what he's done with crime. So basically, as far as I understand, to make it simple, he's just, anyone who's a gang member, he's just thrown them in prison. Just everyone's, it's very huge, there are just prisons everywhere in El Salvador. And as a result of him cracking down on gang violence and not caring too much about the rule of law, just being a bit cavalier in putting a priority on preventing crime rather than the rule of law and justice, that apparently El Salvador used to have about the worst murder rate in the Americas, and now it's got the second best after Canada. So this may be a constructive use of the Mars Saturn square. So I think that perhaps is a way in which Mars Saturn can be used, and I think he's helped perhaps by the fact that his moon is sextile Mars, and the fact that perhaps Mars is square, I suppose, a very strong Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. But I would have said he still has to watch out. I mean, that Mars-Saturn square is tough, but in his case, so far, so good. So let's look at some events with Mars-Saturn square. Now, if we take the sort of Mars-Saturn line, we would expect events taking place with a Mars-Saturn square to be somewhat negative. And, a reminder, we've got Mars-Saturn square today, so what kind of events can we expect? So one event that took place was America's first electrocution with the electric chair. And I think this time is when the victim, well, at least, I mean, I know he killed someone, but so he victimized someone, but the first victim of the electric chair walked into the room at 6:38 a.m. In Auburn, New York. And at that time, Mars was exactly square Saturn. And you can see Mars is opposition Pluto. In fact, I've just noticed this. The first person to be electrocuting electric chair, it happened 6 days before my grandfather's birth. So that's why the chart looked a bit familiar. So my grandfather was using Mars opposition Neptune, opposition Pluto in one way, but another manifestation of this would be the first time someone was executed in an electric chair. And I suppose that fits pretty exactly, doesn't it? I mean, Mars in Sagittarius, you think about fire, electricity. Also, Mars opposition Pluto in Gemini, that it still feels quite electric, doesn't it? And then Mars square Saturn. So I think that does give us a sense of the Mars Saturn square. And continuing on the theme of executions, one big event in British history was the Bloody Assizes. So there was a rebellion against King James II, and there was a judge called Judge Jeffreys. I talked about Judge Jeffreys' chart quite recently, and in fact, someone on the comments actually said that he was a distant ancestor of theirs. But so Judge Jeffreys, he was very much known as a hanging judge. So all of these people who had been involved in this rebellion, in the Monmouth Rebellion, and this took place in Winchester, there was this thing called the Bloody Assizes, and assizes means a trial. And so this is where all these people were sentenced to hang. And this is when the Bloody Assizes started. I don't know exactly what time they started, but this has gone for noon. And you can see that Mars is exactly square Saturn at the time of the Bloody Assizes. So given the fact that Albert Pierpoint had a Mars-Saturn square in his chart, given the fact that the first execution in the United States with an electric chair happened with Mars square Saturn, we've got the Bloody Assizes with Mars square Saturn. Also, there was, if you remember, the Iranian president was killed in a helicopter crash, and he was notorious for a set of executions that took place in 1988 in Tehran, where a lot of opposition activists, loads of them. I think it could have been thousands. There was a mass execution in Tehran on July the 19th, 1988. And again, we see a dissociate. It's not an exact Mars square Saturn, but it's a dissociate square. It's not in mutable signs to mutable signs, but that Mars in Aries is actually within 5 degrees of the square with Saturn here. So again, there may be an association with the death penalty and execution with Mars square Saturn. Now, one of the big events in European history was the fall of Constantinople, when the Turks finally destroyed the Eastern Roman Empire. When fall of Constantinople fell, of course, it was a bloodbath. There were massacres, as you would expect, in 1453. And this was just this huge, really destructive event in European history. And this happened on June the 7th, 1453. And there's Mars at 24 Cancer and Saturn. So Mars, on that day, there was a Mars-Saturn square, and pretty much exact. So I think that gives us an idea about about the Mars-Saturn square. One wonders, were the Turks consulting an astrologer? I mean, I think they would have known about the Mars-Saturn square. I don't think I don't know about astrology in Turkish culture. Maybe not. I don't know. But yeah, exact Mars-Saturn square when this happened. And I suppose things can start well and they can end badly. Like, for example, when Prince Charles got married to Diana on July the 29th, 1981. And so there we have it. Mars at 7 degrees 26 Cancer, square Saturn. And of course that ended, I suppose, in the end with divorce. And I suppose in the end it also ended in Princess Diana's death. This chart, by the way, is very close to the birth date of President of El Salvador. He was also born in 1981. So I think that we're getting an idea about how Mars-Saturn squares work. I think in the natal chart you perhaps have more choice because it's your chart. You can work out how to deal with it. But the very biased selection of charts that I've used does show that Mars-Saturn squares can be difficult. Perhaps they become extra difficult if you decide to become famous. Maybe for ordinary people like me, it's not so important. And as far as events are concerned, I think we do see some themes here, and the execution theme is certainly very interesting. And things might start well but end badly, like with Prince Charles's marriage. Or I suppose one more chart for you, Mars-Saturn square, the European Union, the latest incarnation of European unity. I think that was when the Treaty of Maastricht came into being, November the 1st, 1993 at midnight. There is Mars and pretty closely square Saturn. So that does indicate, perhaps with the European Union, like Charles's marriage to Diana, that in the end it really is just not going to work out. And so I think that if you're trying to choose a timing to, you've got to get that Mars-Saturn, you should try to avoid Mars-Saturn squares. I mean, with the European Union, we're seeing an increasingly totalitarian organization, and I think that's, there you've got that Mars-Saturn square. It's not just Mars-Saturn square, it's Mars conjunct Pluto, square Saturn, and you've got Moon opposition. So that Mars-Saturn is really hardwired into the European Union's DNA now. And I think that it will be trying ever harder to rein everyone in and to crush dissent. And, you can look at how the European Union is so enthusiastic about pursuing this war with Ukraine and supporting the war with Ukraine. So I think that overall, I'm afraid that Mars square Saturn is, I would have said, a bit of a negative influence. So that's it. That is all I'm going to say about the subject of the Mars-Saturn square. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did find it interesting, then of course I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. And if you're not subscribed, of course I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. And if you want to buy me a coffee, there is a link in the description. Anyway, thanks again for listening, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.